Welcome back to another episode of On the Air, a podcast brought to you by Stormwater. On the Air brings together key industry figures, colleagues and customers to explore the latest insight and stories. Our host, Paula Palmer, will be joined each episode by a guest co-host, as well as other special guests, bringing their expertise and experience to our conversations about what matters most in social housing.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Stonewater's On the Air podcast. Today we're tackling a pervasive and often overlooked issue, stigma in social housing. Stigma can take many forms, from the language we use to the way people living in social housing are portrayed in the media. In this episode, we'll be exploring how stigma is created, how it impacts people's lives, and what's being done across the sector to challenge it. We'll hear from researchers, practitioners, and those working in housing to understand how we can break down barriers and promote pride, equity, and inclusion in social housing. I am delighted to introduce today's guest. We're joined by Jo Ross, Service Improvement Manager at Stonewater. We're also joined by Rick Liddiment, Head of External Affairs at Flagship Group and co-author of the Breaking Barriers report, based on understanding and reducing social housing stigma. And authors of the Stigma and Social Housing in England report, Dr. Denedo from Durham University and Professor Amanze Ejiogu from Sheffield Hallam University. Thank you all for joining us today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing some insights on the research you've undertaken. So here we go. Let's start with something around the language we use. We refer to homes, not voids or units or stock, but many organisations in the sector, including Stonewater, have adopted terms like customer, which comes with a bit less favour. So, Jo, why is that, and what might be lost by abandoning the word tenant?
Yeah, sure. I think the word customer is one of those things we've kind of come into in the 21st century a little bit more. We've got a part of that drive to treat customers with a bit more respect. I've just slipped into using the word customer when I didn't really want to, but here we go. It kind of reflects how we've got and kind of aligned ourselves with for more sort of for-profit businesses. And I think you can kind of see that using customer rather than tenant has actually had a positive impact. I mean, you usually can see it as a bit of a signifier that the colleagues who use the word customer often do actually try and treat our customers with respect. And again, I've done it and I'm trying not to, but I think, I'm sure everyone on the call has probably seen examples of stigma expressed, and it's often coupled with the word tenant and how tenant can be used in a sort of pejorative way. So, tenant has done X, tenant won't let us in the house, that sort of thing. And it's often used in place of their name. And so I definitely think customers is in some ways has almost tried to humanise people more. But I do feel like the word customer has a sort of, using it to connote respect kind of highlights a kind of undercurrent of Empress society about the commodification of respect. Why do we need to pretend that tenants are customers to treat them with respect? Why does there have to be a transactional element between us and someone that lives in one of our homes to treat them as if they are a person? It kind of hides a power dynamic between us and them that we kind of pretend we're a supermarket of some case, but we can't. The people that live in our homes they can't shop elsewhere easily. You know as well as I do that anyone that ends up in one of our homes often doesn't have a choice. It's found on a housing register. Sometimes people can't turn it down because then they'll be intentionally homeless. There's all those reasons why we are not Tesco, and you can't just go to Sainsbury's if you want to. It's really hard to move out if you're not receiving a good service, particularly if you can't afford to move to the private sector. You have to wait for months on a housing register waiting list or find a mutual exchange, which can fall through so easily. So there's all those reasons why, we're not really customers. They're not really customers in the way that the word in my mind particularly means. I think it hides that, they are legally our tenants and there is that power relationship between us. And perhaps it can also, in some ways then by hiding that power relationship between us, there is a bit of a problem there that we kind of believe there is more choice than there is. And I think we need to tackle then why tenant is an issue or why that is automatically stigmatizing for a lot of people.
Okay, thanks, Jo. Rick, can you tell us a bit more? So from your research and experience within the housing sector, how does stigma sometimes play out within the sector itself? Perhaps more about the language we use or maybe organisational culture.
For sure. Similar to like what Jo was mentioning, but ultimately, sadly, stigma isn't just external. It can definitely show up internally too. Sometimes, it's in the language that people use, like difficult tenants or, assumptions about who deserves what, that type of thing. And these can really reflect that kind of unconscious bias. So us and them thinking can be sort of where people unintentionally distance themselves from tenants. So, those houses, those new homes are lovely. Even I would live there, that kind of example. And it definitely creates that divide and kind of undermines the trust. And that's why I guess training is fairly crucial. But, it can't really stop there. I think from my perspective, leaders set the tone. And if we're serious about kind of tackling stigma, then it definitely needs to be modelled from the top in how we speak, behave, and I guess prioritise people.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think it's really easy for us to blame stigma on external sources, media and social media and the news and stuff like that. But yeah, it's really important to start closer to home. So Mercy, in your research, as well as identifying stigma in relation to individuals in social housing, the stereotypical unemployed or antisocial neighbour, you also talk about in terms of perception of social housing estates and tenure for vulnerable households. So that's a lot to unravel. Can you tell us some more about the research and how stigma is constructed and reinforced within the housing system?
Thank you, Paula. Myself and Amanze in 2018, we set out to understand how stigma is constructed, how stigma is experienced by social housing tenants, and then how social housing stigma can be challenged. And in 2018, we spoke to over 200 participants. We spoke to social housing tenants, particularly in England. We spoke to board members. We spoke to CEOs. We spoke to housing professionals. We spoke to politicians, councillors, and what we uncovered then was that when you're looking at stigma, you need to understand that there is the external element of stigma and there is also the internal element of stigma. And both of them, they are quite interlinked in relation to government policies around home ownership. The conservative government, then their emphasis was around encouraging people to own their own home. And in terms of championing home ownership policy, they tend to use languages that are stigmatizing to social housing tenants. Most times they see, in order to encourage people to buy their own home, they use the term right to buy to encourage social housing tenants to buy their own council housing without understanding that even when they are selling those houses to social housing tenants, they need to also invest in building more social housing to encourage those who would like to live in social housing to live in social housing. So as a result of government policy, social housing became a residualized tenure, and it's residualized to the most vulnerable in society, the most helpless in society. And the media then capitalized on those negative rhetoric projected by policymakers to justify their home ownership agenda. They capitalized on it. They used language such as sink estate to describe social housing estate. We've heard so many stories from social housing tenants saying, when you look at the media narrative, they see them as lazy, uneducated people, unemployed people. They rely mostly on benefit. But majority of those that we've been engaging with since 2018, even till date, majority of them will tell you that they work. It's just that their take-home pay is not sufficient enough to cover their market rent. So they have no option than to go into social housing. And they work. Some of them, they will tell you they don't even have access to benefit because they work. And also, when you look at the internal stigma, by internal stigma, I'm looking at stigma within the housing association level. Majority said they feel social housing professionals or social housing providers, they see them as weak, as people that they need to take care of. And because of that, their voices are not being heard. They don't have a voice in decision-making. Tenants do not have a voice in decision-making to shape their lived experiences. And majority of those social housing tenants, they feel as a result of this multiple level of stigma, external, internal, that makes them feel worthless and as if they are second-class citizens in society. So, and when you talk about stigma, it affects their lived experiences, it affects the way they themselves, they see themselves because they've internalized this stigma.
Thank you, Mercy. You were talking there about sink estates, those places that are typically characterised by high levels of poorer people, deprivation and crime. But social housing providers are now, and many developers, are trying to mix up tenures to try and prevent that segregation of renters and homeowners, to prevent areas where that might be that need or vulnerability. Joe, would you tell us some more about that? From my experience here at Stonewater, we're providing mixed tenure estates. So does it help with the stigma experienced by residents?
Yeah, I think certainly, mixed tenure developments are often kind of held up as a bit of a silver bullet almost for solving stigma, because like you say, it doesn't create that us versus them, that sink estate, that area where I'm sure we've all heard that sort of, that's an estate you don't want to go through sort of thing. And it certainly has helped with that, and certainly has to help break down that sort of, particularly in terms as well, places that local councils don't give as much investment into and all that sort of stuff. It has really helped with that sort of thing. I think, again, though, if it's not done properly, it can actually contribute to stigma, and with this sort of intra-estate dynamic that can often be at play. So again, those homeowners that live alongside people who live in social housing can often be quite, for want of a better word, cruel almost, see themselves as they shouldn't have to live alongside someone who doesn't own their property. Why should I pay X amount of money to live here and someone gets to live here for cheap, that sort of thing. I think you can see how, in the terms of the design and the way that we hand these over, this even by policy design, we still actually end up contributing to that. So our Section 106s are handed over first. That often means that social housing tenants are moved into estates first when building's not done. It means they live on their own in a building site, which is definitely not pleasant. It means they're there before homeowners move in, and it still creates that us versus them, those people who were here before, that sort of thing, and who often live in houses that have been built for less money and are less well maintained because of the way that they've been built. So I think it's really important that if we do mixed tenure developments, which is definitely the right way to go, that community buildings are a really critical part of that. And that's where places like Stonewater and any other housing association can help with that. So we've got a tenure blind approach. We treat our shared owners exactly the same as we treat social rent tenants, for example, and we try and act as a community focal point. So our neighbourhoods team, for example, they've done some really interesting work where they have skips provided not long after people move into the whole estate, where both our tenants and people who don't live in one of our homes can come along and bring rubbish that they've got from moving in, because we all know that moving in generates an enormous amount of rubbish. And we sort of can act as that community focal point, which is really important to try and make sure that the housing association is not seen as someone who just moves in people who homeowners consider lesser than them, for example. So I think it's really important that, again, we remain vigilant as housing associations as well. We call out snobbery when we see it. It's important for us to defend our tenants in that regard as well, and not just sort of play into that stigma and apologise for it, if you see what I mean. So yeah, I think they're very important, but we can't just assume that on their own they are the be all and end all of it.
Okay, thanks, Joe. That's a good answer, and it shows the level of the task at hand to break down the stigma, isn't it? Amanze, the report talks about stigma existing at both societal and institutional levels, and how do these two layers interact?
Thanks, Paula. I think Mercy started to touch on this earlier. So in our first report on stigma and social housing in England, we saw stigma at a societal level. So this is when you go into the society broadly, and you see that negative perception of social housing. So you see people think about social housing as zones of criminality, full of druggies, people who live there are lazy, don't work, benefit cheats. So you have that negative perception, a lot of it driven by the media, a lot of it driven by political narratives. And so you have that in society. But you have the landlords who exist in that society. So all their staff are part of that larger society. And then they bring those attitudes into the organization. But the landlord is now directly interfacing with the tenant. And so you have that level of stigma within the organization. And what it then does within the organization is to create all sorts of disrespect, negative attitudes towards the tenants. A lot of what we've seen is paternalistic attitudes towards tenants. So we look at the tenants as being incapable, unable to do things for themselves. We need to do things for the tenants. And so the tenant is there to be controlled. Things are done to the tenant rather than with the tenant.
Thanks, Amanze. So in housing, we're often talking about home being like pivotal for social mobility, but as we can see, this obviously depends on the home. We hear about postcode lotteries, but this is altogether different, and job opportunities and how people are perceived just by the place they live. And one common bit of stigmatisation is the belief that a social housing home is a lesser standard or run down. So Rick, can you tell us some more about the link between repairs and maintenance and demonstrating how tenants feel respected?
Yeah, for sure. I guess repairs are often seen as like the front line of how tenants judge our respect for them. So when service is poor or dismissive, it can definitely feel like their homes and I guess by extension their well-being, particularly tenants, doesn't matter. For some, like living with those kind of unresolved issues, consistently sitting around it can definitely impact mental health, especially when it feels like no one is listening, particularly a landlord. So I guess it is short and simple in some ways. On the flip side, like timely quality repairs do more than fix a problem. They really restore trust, and they show tenants that we care, that we're reliable, and we're on their side.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. Mercy, whilst we're sort of talking about repairs, could you tell us some more about the Tackling Stigma Journey Planner that was produced with the Stop Social Housing Stigma tenant-led campaign group? I was interested to read the repairs and contractor flyer, the one that says, treat me with respect and I will have the same level of service. I'm not lazy. I do work. I would like an appointment to suit my working hours and that sort of thing. And then there's the bit where you've broken it down into tickets. And one of those also refers to repairs. So tell us some more.
Yeah, thank you. I think when we started this project, myself and Amanze in 2018, we've heard so many stories from tenants, because after the initial report in 2021, we had a consultation with social housing tenants, policymakers, housing professionals to understand what we can do collectively to address stigma in social housing. And in 2022, we published a report on the consultation responses. But following that report, we felt there is need for us to do more to work with housing providers to understand how issues around disrepair affect tenants' well-being, affect their self-esteem. So since 2023, we've been working with Stop Social Housing Stigma campaign, the Chartered Institute of Housing, TPAS, YD consultants to develop what we now call the Stigma Journey Planner. When we started in 2023, the initial plan was to develop a pledge and a toolkit, if we have to develop a toolkit to address stigma. A majority of the feedback we got from the survey responses were like, no, we don't want another set of toolkit because we already have quite a lot of that across the sector and we can't really see the impact of that on our lived experiences. So we want something that housing professionals and providers can develop collectively with their tenants to tackle stigma. So following that survey responses, we developed an initial draft of the Stigma Journey Planner, and then we had a series of focus group conversation with tenants. I think we had 8 focus group conversation with tenants, not just one tenant. In the focus group, we had up to 8 tenants attending the focus group conversation because of how important the issues around stigma is to them. We had a focus group conversation with housing providers, and then we had one with contractors. And from the focus group conversation, we then went back to revise what we now have as a Stigma Journey Planner. And since last year, we've piloted the Stigma Journey Planner with 10 housing providers, I think 5 councils, and then 6 housing associations. And the initial draft of the Journey Planner was designed to enable housing providers to work with their tenants to understand how issues that affect stigma can be resolved collectively and to give tenants a platform to actually engage with their housing providers to get their voices heard around issues around service delivery, repair, because majority of the issues that when you look at the internal stigma, majority of the issues around the internal stigma has to do with issues around service delivery and repairs. And in the pilot phase, we ran a series of workshops with the pilot organization to develop this Stigma Journey Planner to understand what needs to go into the Stigma Journey Planner to understand how effective the Stigma Journey Planner will be to them. So when we did the pilot, we had 12 tickets. One was around tenants leading change. One was around issues around trust, because most tenants, they do not trust the housing providers. One was around staff culture. Was around organizational governance and how stigma can be embedded in organizational culture. And from the piloting, majority felt the tickets were quite too long and too cumbersome for housing providers to work with. So what we've now done is to streamline the ticket into 6. We will be launching this journey planner next month. But the emphasis is to provide a platform for housing providers to collaborate with their tenants to address issues around stigma, to give tenants a platform to get their voices heard internally and to influence decision-making at the board level, at the operational level, and to get people to understand that tenants should be seen as a valuable resource in decision-making. You can't make a decision without consulting tenants, so they have to be at the forefront of decision-making. So that's the core purpose of the Stigma Journey Planner. And from the pilot phase, we've seen positive responses from the we call them pioneer travelers, the piloting organization, we call them pioneer travelers. We've seen positive feedback from them because they've been able to bring both contractors, tenants, and housing professionals into the room to understand how issues around culture can be addressed, how issues around service delivery can be improved, how issues around repairs can be addressed.
Fantastic. I'm looking forward to seeing the new journey planner and lots of people taking it up. On the topic of results, Joe, could you share us an example of how Stonewater support services have helped someone overcome the barriers linked to stigma?
Yeah, so we've got a number of services that you just wouldn't be available in the private sector. So one of the ones we've got an employment specialist, so someone that helps provide advice and apply for grants and the sort of thing that help people get over the barriers that are there to finding stable employment, and often also not necessarily finding stable employment, but also moving on up ladders and into jobs that are perhaps more desirable. So, for example, we've provided in the past a grant to get someone a Class 1 HGV license, for example. So, that's a really good skill job that is a massive barrier to get into because you need to pay up to £5,000 to do the learning in the first place. So we've also helped a customer named Brian, for example, who was provided our grant through our Longley Foundation, which is our partner charity, to get forklift refresher training and then also pay for travel expenses and workplace appropriate clothing and all that sort of stuff. Things that if you're more privileged, you don't think of as a barrier to getting into work, the capital costs that are there in the first place. So while I'm inherently aware that what we're doing here is helping people to get into stable employment, we're still not necessarily tackling that stigma against unemployed people. What we are trying to do is at least try and make it clear that the barriers that are preventing people getting into stable employment are often not our tenants' fault. It's things that are just simply structural in stopping people getting in place. So I think what we've tried to do with these services is try and break down those things that are stopping people, that are stigmatizing people, that someone like Brian, who might have been feeling stigmatized and had poor mental health because of it, we know now that his mental health has improved. He's now into stable work. This is really important things that help him feel better about himself and hopefully therefore, and that's the most important thing, but also hopefully therefore make some of those ideas around employment break down the stigmas.
Lovely. Thanks, Joe. And sort of a good example that a social housing home is a good place to be in once you can strip away the negativity surrounding it. Amanze, in your work, what kinds of organisational behaviours did you uncover that unintentionally perpetuate stigma?
I think with organisations, one of the things which we've seen is that stigma is an issue of culture. And so there's this ingrained culture which is disrespectful to the tenant, which views the tenant as incapable. And if we think about the Ombudsman's report on Rochdale Borough Housing, the 2-year-old who died there, Awab Ishaq, one of the things which the report talks about is this culture of disrespect, and not just in Rochdale, but talking about it being endemic across the sector. And so this kind of drives all sorts of behaviors within the organization. You see tenants talking about, especially with regards to repairs, they phone in and to report a repair, and they are passed from pillar to post. When a repair is booked, they are not consulted as to time. It's just booked, and the assumption is the tenant is at home because the tenant doesn't work. And then you see contractors turn up without notice. They do a shoddy job. there's no explanation to the tenant what's going on. They leave the job halfway and they walk away, without any kind of explanation. We talk about, changes within the organization or changes broadly around the living environment, which impacts on tenants. They are not consulted. And when they are consulted, it's a tick box kind of thing. It says we should consult you, so we've spoken to you, but we really don't take your views into account. And so you have an organization which does not feel that it's accountable to tenants, or it should be accountable to tenants. An organization that feels that the tenant voice is not important. And that's kind of where stigma leads. And we see that across a range of organizations. While organizations are different kind of places and some are better than others, generally there's that underlying culture which does not view the tenant as one who deserves the kind of respect and dignity which you would give to, say, a homeowner.
Yeah, it's a shame that level of respect just isn't granted, isn't it? It just should be a given for whoever you are and whoever you're dealing with. We're all people. Rick, I know that you've also worked with the Stop Social Housing Stigma Group, and you've spoken about how campaigns can unintentionally reinforce stigma. So what does a more empowering approach look like?
Yeah. Too often we see stories and campaigns framed around successes, meaning someone has escaped from social housing. But that reinforces the idea that that social housing is something to rise above. And we really need to shift that. I think, campaigns should definitely highlight the thriving that goes on within social housing, not just despite it. That means telling stories of strength, pride, and real community. These real voices genuinely matter. So we really need to make space for tenants to lead that narrative and let authenticity cut through the stereotypes. I think they've been created by a minority, and it's time to kind of cut through that and tell social housing, highlight social housing for what it really is. It's a foundation to thrive, really.
Yeah, I think these celebrity campaigns, I think they're trying to do a good thing, but actually, from those, I always get that escape narrative. I came from there, but now I'm doing better. Whereas, like you say, we need more storytelling of how people are in it and enjoying it and thriving. Fantastic. Mercy, so what were some of the most striking impacts of stigma has on tenants based on the interviews and focus groups you've held?
Recently, I had a chat with someone who said there was a contractor that came to fix a problem in a house. And when the contractor walked in, the first thing the contractor said was, "Oh, your house is clean and nice. How long have you been living in this house?" When she told me, I was like, "Are you actually sure?" So that person said, "Yeah, that was what he said. Your house is clean and nice. How long have you been living in this house?" So is that perception that those who live in social housing are dirty? They live in rough area, they don't have. So in that sense, it creates the sense of worthlessness that they're just second-class citizens. And majority of them, some of those that we've spoken to said, oftentimes they've internalized this stigma because when they go for a job application, for instance, they get interviewed. We've heard stories from tenants who said they knew they did well, but when they came back with their feedback, they were not offered the job. And they went back to the interview and said, "Okay, we've done this interview with you. Can you provide more feedback?" And the feedback they got was, "If you want a job, you need to change your postcode. So if you don't change your postcode, we can't offer you this job because your postcode is linked to crime." And the same thing with insurance, same thing with access to applying for insurance or opening up a bank account. The moment they can link their postcode to a social housing estate, automatically the insurance premium goes up because they feel they live in a crime zone. So that will affect the kind of services the insurance company can provide. Also at work, we've heard stories of social housing tenants saying they can't go to work and tell their colleagues where they live because the moment they mention that they live in a social housing or social housing estate, they look down on them instantly, and that make them feel as if they're second-class citizens. And we've heard stories of poor door stigma, particularly in London, where in a new built estate, particularly in an high-rise tower, where there are separate entrances for those who have bought their homes and those who are on social rent. So those that own their own home, they have this luxury entrance. We can see everything shining, but for social housing tenant, you have just a tiny pathway to their own home. So that creates a sense of segregation, and majority of those who live or have lived in such housing, they feel as if they are second-class citizens because there's no way they can get things changed. And even within the housing providers level, they feel they don't really have a voice to influence decision making. So the housing providers only come to them when decisions have already been made about issues that will affect them. So they don't have a voice. So that creates a sense of disrespect because majority of those that were spoken to feel as if nobody actually respect them. The housing providers do not respect them. The policymakers do not respect them. The media do not respect them. And they don't have any means of engaging or changing that narrative. So majority have been crying for the creation of a national tenant voice, at least to enable them to challenge the societal stigma, to enable them to engage with policymakers, the media. And majority of us also argued for social housing tenants to be on the board of housing providers in order to shape policies, in order to influence decisions around housing, service delivery, repairs, and things like that.
Wow, it's shocking, isn't it? Just all those levels of stigma and disrespect. I'm surprised at some of those that we heard there. Amanze, can you tell us some more? I think Mercy started touching on sort of customer voice and stuff there. So what is missing from current tenant involvement structures and how can we do better to start tackling this?
I think if we look at current structures, again, we need to look at them at kind of the organizational level and at the societal level. At the organizational level, what you have is things like tenants on boards and scrutiny groups. But we've seen these as problematic also. So with tenants on boards, we have tenants who are on boards who tell us that, when they go on the board, they are still sidelined. They are still told, when you go on that board, you need to remove the tenant hat, and don't think of yourself as a tenant on the board. We've seen cases where scrutiny groups have taken a section of operation to scrutinize. They've come up with a report which is critical of the organization in those areas with learning points. And instead of taking that on board, the organization dissolves the scrutiny group and buries the report. So we've seen those as while they might make some movement towards tenant involvement, there needs to be some genuine commitment to making sure that these work. Underlying all of this is really a power imbalance. So the tenants have lost their power in the sector. When we started talking about a co-regulatory approach to regulation of the sector, the idea was to have tenants, landlords, and the regulator together as co-regulators. The tenants have been sidelined from that arrangement, so now it's really the landlord and regulators. What needs to happen is to put the tenants back in that equation so that you have a proper co-regulatory approach. And at the kind of national level, again, you see it, with the landlords, you have the National Housing Federation speaking on their behalf when we're thinking about policy making. Nobody really speaks on the tenants' behalf. No, their voice is not heard at that policy level. And so we need to think about how do we have a national tenant voice or a voice which speaks for tenants at that national level when we're talking about policy making. So it needs to be approached both at the organizational level and at the more societal policy making level.
Right. There's some terrible cases of just playing lip service to customer involvement, isn't there? Joe, can you tell us about how Stonewater are ensuring tenant inclusion doesn't become tokenistic?
Yeah, that's, Amanze said, is really important to make sure that scrutiny panels, they don't just ignore what's been given to them, that we don't just ask for that information and then just ignore it when we don't like what's been said.
Such a waste of time, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So obviously we've got our customer inclusion panel, which is the scrutiny panel. And, in that we've now got it in place. It's reasonably new. Perhaps 2-3 years or so it's been in place. What we're trying to do is make that more and more more and more influential, more and more making sure that that is taking it into account every single thing that we do, every single change that we make. The inclusion panel reviews it, feedback given, and the keyword that obviously is implemented as well. So not making sure we're not just asking for it. We've already decided what we want to do, and then if we don't like what we hear, then we're just going to ignore it. That's making sure very much that we're not doing that. I think we've still had some issues in terms of, making sure that panel is truly representative. We've tried really very hard to get young people involved, and there's been a struggle there in terms of just getting that involvement. So we've tried with some of our young people's voice, for example, we've tried making sure that they're offered the chance to be involved, and the interest is just not necessarily there. We do tend to get like young people's voices, for example, from surveys, but obviously surveys are very, very passive. We get not the same level of engagement that you do from a scrutiny panel, for example. So that has been a challenge, but I think where we can say we've been really, really inclusive of disabled people, for example. So a high proportion of our scrutiny panel are people with a disability, and that, that's really important. We've mentioned quite a few times on this podcast about the amount of times that people just assume that social housing tenants are just available all times of the day. I mean, particularly for people with disabilities, there is that just assumption that access is easy and should be given at all times. And I don't think necessarily takes that into account. So something that we've done as an organisation, we have tried to make sure that we are taking on board everything that's given to us. Of course, we certainly can do better. And I think as we continue to implement this process and get it more and more organisationally sort of just part of the furniture, I think it will become more and more effective. I mean, the work that our customer engagement team led by Jade do is really, really good. And yeah, I think it's something we're acutely aware of. It shouldn't be tokenistic, and we're trying our best to make sure it isn't as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, sort of the range of ways that people can become involved, isn't it? And trying to encourage that level of diversity, like you say, about encouraging different age groups, because we don't all think the same, do we? Okay, so here's the dream reality, Rick. How can housing associations become brands that people admire?
Well, yeah. I guess, it's a tough question, but branding, it shapes perception. So in housing, I think that's a huge opportunity. So when we're consistent in how we show up, speak and listen, we definitely earn trust. So if we look at brands outside the sector, so the ones that stand out for me are clear on their values. So they lead with purpose, they're people focused. So let's take, Greggs, for example. They're a brand that knows its audience, it leads with authenticity. It's accessible, unpretentious, and it's definitely built that strong emotional connection with people across the UK. But it definitely shows that, I guess, it's proud of being for everyone. And that's super powerful, I think. And also IKEA. They've democratized kind of good design. They show that good design, quality, comfort isn't just for the wealthy. Their messaging often sort of focuses on home, belonging, and sustainability, all of the things that kind of suit best with, I guess, social housing and what we should represent. So, and they do it in a way that's, I think, fairly global, but definitely personal. So for us, and I guess for the sector, it means that sharing powerful human stories, creating that kind of strong visual identity, and showing that social housing is something to be proud of. So, it's not hidden, it's not apologised for, and it's certainly not a last resort.
Yeah, fantastic. That's great. I like that last bit you said there about it not being a last resort. But messy. Some housing providers are worried that tackling stigma might require resources they don't have. How would you respond to their concerns, and what small practical steps can organisations start with?
I would probably say it won't cost them anything to challenge stigma and to work with their tenants to address issues around stigma. From piloting the stigma journey planner, we've realized that it won't cost anything to bring tenants into the room to understand how service delivery affects them, how it affects their lived experience, and how it impacts on their well-being. It's also important for housing providers to know that they need to address issues around stigma because, one, it will affect how they implement or comply with regulatory standards, particularly when you look at the consumer regulations around treating tenants with fairness and respect. And to address these issues, housing providers, they need to understand that there's need for tenants to have a voice in decision making and for those voices to be heard, not just inviting them to attend meetings just to tick a box. No, you have to understand that when you invite them into the room, you need to understand, you need to get their voices heard, and you need to have a platform where you can feed back to them on how their voices have been incorporated into decision making and into operational policies as well, because majority of those housing social housing tenants that we've spoken to felt, even when they are members of board, members of scrutiny panels, they don't get to hear anything from their housing providers on what they've said, how they've said it have been used to influence policies. So there's this communication breakdown between the housing providers and them, even when they've tried to engage, and they can't really see the impact of such engagement. So there's a need for tenants to have a voice, and those voices have to be meaningful if we have to challenge stigma. And also housing providers need to be accountable to their tenants, not just being accountable to the regulators, but they need to be accountable to their tenants, and that will enable them to improve on their tenant satisfaction. I don't think it will cost them anything to invite tenants to the room to have a one-to-one conversation on, okay, these issues that is affecting you, what can we do to make things different? What can we do to address these issues? Tenants are willing to engage. Majority of those that we've been engaging with since 2018 and even recently, they are willing to engage. All they are waiting for is they're waiting for housing providers to create that platform where they can easily engage with them.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. That's more about that kind of inclusivity and chatting and talking on an equal level, isn't it? And I was interested to read about the paternalistic nature of social housing and how it's have an effect. And that's one thing I'm going to take back to my day job, about how we talk about our services and our role to our customers or tenants or however we're referring to them. So, Joe, I would like you to add a little bit there. What steps do you think we could take to bring back the positive role of social housing and supporting social mobility?
I think a really wider one is simply just to build some more and make sure that government house building targets are met. It's been touched on by, I think, pretty much by everyone, Rick and Mercy particularly, I think, where we've talked about how social housing is now seen as a last resort, whereas if you look back at the 1940s through to the early 1970s, mid-70s, for example, social housing was a big proportion of our housing stock, and it's got smaller and smaller, and I don't think it's particularly surprising to see that as it's got smaller, the stigma's got bigger. I think you sort of can see the kind of like the introduction of right to buy, and particularly Margaret Thatcher's sort of belief, and the government at the time as well, the belief that a home-owning democracy is what Britain should be, because they believe that to have a stake in society, you needed to own property, has been really, really damaging. And I think to try and push back against that, and again, bring back the fact that social housing can be a positive role for social housing, for social mobility, we need to try and start thinking about limiting right to buy, for example. We need to be looking at making sure that all the proceeds from any right to buys are actually reinvested back in social housing, and making sure that we are building more and not just losing that housing stock and having a sort of net negative loss in certain places. I think that's really important. I think ultimately that, until we start making sure that we are building and expanding, it's not going to be seen as anything other than a last resort for people who are on and below the poverty line. My dad was born in social housing in 1953, and it was completely and utterly normal for just a normal working person to be in social housing. And I think we've got to the point now where it's seen that it would be now seen as not normal per se, or not something that the majority of working class people should be aiming for. They should be aiming to be in a private rent until they can afford to buy. And that, I think, is something we need to challenge.
Great. Thanks, Joe. It's interesting how the perception of social housing has changed over time, isn't it? I'm going to give a little plug to our history of social housing on our website. You can find the timeline if you're interested at socialhousinghistory.stonewater.org. I think it's also frustrating that housing providers now, who offer so much more than a home, that they're often thought of so poorly, and, in some way that adds to the stigma, doesn't it? So, Rick, can you tell us what role social media can play in amplifying positive narratives about tenants and social housing?
Yeah, no problem. Social media is a funny one. It's like a double-edged sword, isn't it? I guess, it can definitely spread those harmful stereotypes super quickly that we spoke about earlier, especially in that kind of short-form content where the nuance is lost. There's not a huge amount of context, particularly in the kind of short, snappy videos. But I think it's also a chance to really tell our story in our own words. So the key for me is being proactive. So we need campaigns that are controlled, thoughtful, and genuinely reflect tenant experiences. So when done well, I think that social media can really challenge those misconceptions. It can definitely support and build pride, and ultimately reach new audiences, and particularly those that might never have heard these stories otherwise. There's a lot of people out there who just hear things from other people and they don't actually see it like at source. And I think it's a tool to be able to share those real stories about social housing if done correctly. And I think when we see or when we hear about campaigns or posts that aren't necessarily the truth, I think individually as people, we should be able to call that out amongst friends and colleagues as well.
Yeah, fantastic. And I'm going to be watching our content to make sure we're not unintentionally reinforcing stigma. It's just kind of made me really aware of the language we've used, to be fair, talking to you all today. So we have uncovered a lot today, from the root causes of stigma to the efforts underway to challenge it across the housing sector. So before we wrap up, I've got one final question that I'm going to pose to each of you. So, looking ahead, what's the one thing you think housing providers should focus on to challenge stigma and promote pride in social housing? And I'm going to start with Amanze.
I think with social housing and stigma, one of the things which the organization needs to do is to look at root causes. So in a lot of organizations, we have organizations doing things to retrain staff or looking at service delivery, but they are treating symptoms. What they need to do is to address the root cause, and that has to do with organizational culture. They need to start there and address culture. As they address culture, the other things will start to change. And so for me, the focus will be on culture, on their values, because what we're again seeing with a lot of organizations is a shift away from their social values to become more business-like. And so again, that feeds into some of the stigma. So that refocus on values and culture, and then build out from there.
Lovely. Thank you. Mercy?
What Amanze has said. Also, I think to address stigma, looking at the organizational level, then there's a need for housing providers to engage more with their tenants, to ensure that their tenants, they have a voice and their voices are being heard on service delivery, on repairs issue, or on any issues that affect them, on how decisions are being made, on how finances are being utilized. They need to have a voice in shaping decisions around such. And also, housing providers, they need to understand that even though they're accountable to the regulators, they're also accountable to tenants, and they should be accountable to tenants. So they need to create an effective accountability system where they can give accounts of their operations to tenants, and tenants can also feedback on their performance, on how they can improve services. And lastly, we've developed the Stigma Journey Planner, and we hope that more housing providers will be able to look at the tickets in the Stigma Journey Planner and self-assess themselves against those tickets and see how they can work together to tackle stigma in social housing. I hope that housing providers can pick up a copy of the Stigma Journey Planner and look at how it can help them to shape policies around stigma, around service deliveries.
Joe?
It's difficult to find anything that hasn't been said now, but I think just to echo particularly what Mercy was saying as well about inclusion, I think we'd be really important just to remember we can't, even if we're trying to be well-meaning, we often assume rather than ask first. And I think in removing that assumption would be really important, just to try to make sure that we don't come across as paternalistic and try and think we're doing the best for people without asking for them. So I think I'd go very much on that.
Lovely. Thank you. And last but not least, Rick.
No worries. I'll stay in my lane a little bit on this one. I think sort of read what you've written before you publish, like think about how the tone comes across if there is, and you're accidentally creating a them and us. But secondly, share those powerful stories, get them out there, the positive stories of social housing. As I mentioned earlier, create that strong visual identity, showcase social housing for what it is. And I'll say it again, obviously because you liked it, but make sure that it's something you can be proud of, not hidden or apologize for, and certainly not a last resort. So a true foundation for people to thrive is what I think. So just take that step back and read what you've got.
Fantastic. Definitely something I'm going to be taking away for my day job. So I want to thank you all for joining me on the Air and for sharing your thoughts and research with us. Tackling stigma isn't going to happen overnight, but by listening, acting and working together, we can start to shift perceptions and hopefully create a more inclusive, respectful housing system. That's it for today's episode of On the Air. Thank you to our guests and listeners for joining us. We'll be back soon with more conversations on the future of social housing.
We hope you enjoyed listening to the latest episode of On the Air. We'll be publishing a new episode again soon. To stay up to date, subscribe to our channel. Thanks again for listening, and don't forget to share your thoughts with us on LinkedIn by typing #SW on the air.